So, speaking of mom stuck in the kitchen, because most of these homes are not open concept in the 1950s, women in the 1950s had a bit of an interesting experience. Remember, during World War II, women were told that it was patriotic for them to leave the house, even if they had kids at home, to go to work, to support the war effort, right? To bring their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their fathers home faster from war. But at the end of World War II, the message overwhelmingly that women were giving was okay, now that your man is home, you need to quit work and ideally be a stay at home wife and mother. Despite this message, more women were working during the 1950s. After initially losing industrial jobs after World War II, by the late 1950s, women worked at a higher rate than they had during the war. The jobs that they had, however, changed. Most women tended to work in clerical or service industry positions where the pay was lower on average um, for all workers, but women also experienced a lower rate of pay in comparison to men. In 1960, working women earned about 60 cents for every dollar that men working in the same position did. Okay, this is what we call the wage gap. The idea that men and women working and doing the same exact job are paid at a different rate based on their gender. Today, the wage gap has closed somewhat. Now it's about 80 cents to a dollar for white women, but the wage gap is still very much more difficult for African American and Latina women. Latina women in particular still only make about 55 cents to a dollar for a male colleague doing the same job. So the wage gap is still around. It has improved since the 1950s. But again, depending upon the racial and ethnic status of the woman, the wage gap is still very much in force and fluctuates. The idea of women working in the 1950s was in a perfect world, a woman shouldn't need to work, that her husband, the male breadwinner, was making enough money at his job to be able to allow his wife to stay home, that they didn't need the money. However, many families pitch women working as a way to supplement their family income. So, in other words, if mom had a part time job working at, say, a cashier at a local store, that she was doing it not because the family needed the money, but ideally so that when the family could afford to buy more things, right? So that women working was a choice that a family made to be able to maintain a certain standard of living and buy more stuff. So that's part of the thought process too behind paying women less was this notion that, well, women who are working are doing so because they want to, not because they need to support their family. So that was an early argument against paying women the same for doing the same jobs as men. At home, there is a much higher rate of marriage and birth during the 1950s. The average age that people got married in the 50s was 22 for men and 20 for women. So people are getting married in their very early 20s, shortly out of high school. And the divorce rate was very low. So even if someone was in an unhappy marriage, they tended to stay together and not get divorced, largely due to economic reasons. Because again, for women, if they divorced and they had to become self sustainable, they didn't have a great selection of jobs or good pay to choose from. The birth rate during this time period is higher. The average American family had about 3.2 children. I don't know what that 0.2 comes from. I'm going to joke and say it represents like a cat or something. Today, the average American birth rate is closer to about 2. Okay. So the birth rate leads to what we call the baby boom. From 1945 to 1965, this is the baby boomer generation. 30 million people are born in the United States. That's about a 20% population growth. So a lot of parents are having a lot of kids. For example, my parents are both baby boomers. My dad is one of 7 children, and my mom is one of 4. Okay, so the average size of the American family is drastically increasing during this time. So, given the fact that more Americans are having more kids, the ideal for women is that they're supposed to stay at home, right? Be stay at home wives and mothers. But during the 1950s, there's also this emphasis on how spouses should be compatible, right? That they shouldn't just marry for economic necessity, right? That it needed to be a love match, there needed to be respect in the relationship. Spouses were expected to enjoy each other's company in leisure activities, in consumption of consumer products, and also in the bedroom. It's no coincidence that early famous studies on human sexuality take place during this time period, including the Kinsey study and the Masters and Johnson study about human sexuality and sexual activities. The expectation was for women that they should enjoy being at home, and that if they were unhappy with life as a stay at home wife and mother, then she was somehow defective, that she was lacking a maternal instinct. And we're going to talk about this more as we talk about second wave feminism in the 1960s. But a lot of women questioned this notion that they either were happy with this domestic life or they were just defective. A lot of women really struggled with this, right? That I'm supposed to enjoy staying at home with my kids and I don't. What's wrong with me? And there's also a marked increase in women seeking help and taking pills and other things to cope with this unhappiness with domestic life. So, what's going to really kick off this second wave feminism is a book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, in which she specifically criticizes the standards of the 1950s and the message being sold to women that if you're not perfectly happy and full of bliss in living this domestic lifestyle, then you're flawed and broken.